Good morning, everybody. And I think one of the things that happens when you've got three speakers in a kind of broad topic is by the time the third speaker comes along, most of it has been said. So I'm going to kind of maybe just dwell on a couple of things that came up over the course of things. I have a set of slides here, but just to give that structure, I probably should have had no slides and just not winged it, but if you know what I mean, just responded. I suppose, if like before I came into the room, my sense is to say, well, what are the actual key elements for successful planning of healthcare in Ireland? When you think about that, what are they? And a really big thing that sounds so incredibly obvious, I think the bleeding obvious is sometimes what is described as, is that there need to be clear and shared objectives for the system. And that sounds so obvious, and you say, well, why? And Leo touched on, why is it that we really haven't had that over a period of time? And I was really delighted to hear some of what Jim said, because when I chaired this report in 2010, I can tell you his department didn't think about anything other than the public system. I had battle royal with so many civil servants in the department, they just didn't get it. That if you're thinking about a system, you need to see all elements in the system, the public and the private. It'd be like, you know, the IDA or Enterprise Ireland only thinking about some firms and not others, and then looking at trying to understand our exports or our performance or our outcomes. So there's been a huge change, and I think that's really, really to be welcomed. I mean, so the shared understanding of the current system is a big part of that. And by that sharing, I mean, I'm very conscious of the fact that people in their own areas understand their own areas very, very well, but they really don't understand each other. They don't actually have that full point. And if this shared thing is to work, what you have to do is to make sure that everybody at the front line connects up to whatever the strategy is. If you don't have that, you're actually just talking another report on another shelf. And I have 2 copies of my report at home on my shelf, and they're on the shelves everywhere. And that's what happens. So you really have to get that connection the whole way down. Just to give you an example of a country which is doing that very strongly is Scotland, where they brought in a very strategic approach to their economic strategy. Now let's leave their independence debate to one side, but just talking about their economic strategy, they have set up the whole of the civil service to map into that strategy so that every civil servant knows where he or she connects to the strategy. Now, they've done that very well. They're now having to deal with the outer ring, if you like, which is a little bit like the hospital sector in a way. They're having to deal with the other sort of circular public sector agencies around it. They didn't do that at the beginning, and now they're getting the costs of it. So there's really getting that link in is huge. And obviously a dynamic perspective. A little bit about the language today, is the notion that where we want to be in 10 years. But of course, it's a moving target all the time. So in some ways, I think 10 years is the absolute minimum to think through. And I know politically getting out to 10 years was a huge achievement. But it is actually very important that people within the planning system, I mean, if you build a hospital, if you get new equipment, you've got to think of longer than 10 years. And there needs to be alignment of future plans with the shared objectives. So if we really are saying that we want to take care into the community and into the primary care system, well, if we don't have these plans aligned with that, it just is going to sit there. It's just simply not going to happen. And as Leo pointed out, it's been around for quite a long time. That means capital investments and current expenditures being aligned. And I say capital and recurrent because there's no point in giving people money for a hospital or giving them tax incentives to do something and then effectively not giving them the recurrent budgets to work with it. We did that in the 90s. There were horrendous cases of, fantastic facilities in Hospital X, but actually no staff to man it, and that just doesn't work. We need to think about the scale of the system, and I was taken by Jim's the numbers that he put out there in terms of actually where is the system heading to, and if we like we did with the so many of the roads we built at different stages or the M50, if you don't actually look properly at what the system is going to be, you're going to be constantly trying to catch up. And the technology potential is very considerable there, but you need you don't know with certainty what's 30 years out, but you can begin to look out and see where you might be. And I think, and this is really the tough part for Irish people, is to recognise explicitly the main impediments to achieving the objectives. What are the main impediments? The historic arrangements and structures. We just have to get past that and be able to discuss it openly and constructively as to how we move beyond it. The poor systems of resource allocation, which actually don't link the incentives of the system with the incentives of the person on the ground, whether they're budget holders or whether they're healthcare suppliers or whatever they're doing. The legacy of the focus on providers rather than patients. Now that was very interesting because people talk about patient-focused care, and I think that's really important across the 3 sectors of delivery. But there's more to patient-focused than just that. There's also saying not being provider-focused, not thinking about the providers first and what they can deliver second. It's actually driving it by what the patient needs and what the providers need to do. I think that is something which has come to the fore in this in some of the recent reports, and I think it's very important. By the way, there's a parallel in the university sector. They're now talking about student-centered learning. Oh, shock! Student-centered learning, but it's actually the equivalent of the patient-centered support. When you've had a system that has been legacy focused on providers, you're going to get vested interests. And the vested interests are very strong. Let's all admit that, let's know that, let's not go into it, a bit like the Brits at Brexit. Don't be going into those discussions without knowing what's out there. I think it's really important that in those negotiations that's there. And there have been, and it's been touched on, weak governance and inadequate contracts. The weak governance means that the governance stops somewhere. It might stop actually at the top and never get past the top level, but sometimes it gets down halfway down the system. If it's lost at the lower end of the system, it's actually not governance. You basically haven't got the system melded together. And we've inadequate contracts. So the recent reports, I think, and I'm going to do this very quickly, have a very holistic and long-term perspective. And by the recent reports, I put in my own, which isn't really recent at all. But the reason I put that there is really to remind us that there has been progress in that time, even though we haven't had any report that's been taken in the same direction. There have been some reports, and there has been progress made. So patient rather than provider focus, fair, equitable, and needs-based approach. All of these reports commend integrated, fit-for-purpose care. Who would disagree? Who's actually going to stand, oh no, we shouldn't have to integrate at all? No, you're not going to get that. So of course you're going to get it, everybody's going to agree. It's just a question of, are you setting up the mechanisms to make it work like that? So that means delivery by the right skills and facilities in the right places, the usual expression, efficient and evidence-informed use of resources. So, you know, it is that notion of looking at what works, and there's lots of best practice around the country. We have to ask ourselves, why does it not travel faster? Why does it work in some places and not in others? Of course, you're going to have better success in some areas than others, but you want to make sure that that travels. And you need a sustainable funding model. I think this is where the department and the minister comes in. I mean, if you're going to have year-to-year uncertainty in funding, it's an extremely unhelpful environment to be creating for anybody. And then commit to the implementation of the necessary change. And I see the necessary change rather than glamorizing it and making it a dramatic change. This is, you know, healthcare, what I saw in the work that I did in 2009-10, was just when you looked across the world, everybody's incrementing, everybody's trying to cope. It's that quotation about the using up the whole of the budget on healthcare is a very plausible thing to do if you don't actually decide that you're working this properly. So we're not alone in this, and I think this is one of the most frustrating things for me as an economist, and I'm not a health economist at all. But as an economist looking at the health sector from the outside and saying that, you know, people looking for dramatic changes, looking for things to be radically different, and then when there are small incremental changes made, and they all add up to the big change, ultimately, that doesn't get recognised. The media is incredibly, in some sense, cruel to the system. It doesn't really recognise what's going on. So no big bang structural changes, and I think perfection is the enemy of the good, which we've just had. So what do we want? Okay. We don't know. What do we want? We want to have elements in the healthcare system that integrate together. So there's the quality care, we want the fairness and equity, we want allocations based on population health needs because we know that that's been an issue in the past. We want funding and financial incentives that make sense, that incentivize people to work in the direction that achieves what the strategy is. And I think ultimately there's going to be public and private involvement in healthcare for a long period of time. So get over it, get working with it, and actually, you know, think in systems terms where the public and the private sector are both working in roles. So that's what's required to have an integrated healthcare system. So what do we have? This is what we want, but what we have is by and large disconnected sectors, and there's quite a lot in the Sloan to Care report that talks about how to connect. It's really hard because you've got people who've been culturally reared and educated and through all their lives in these silos. And silos are a very comfortable place to be because you talk to the other people in your silo and guess what, you all agree. The problem is in the other place. I spent 30 years in Trinity, and it was incredible how many of the problems were caused by the second level education system. Yeah, it wasn't us at all, not at all. The notion that we weren't actually saying, well, if they're coming in like this, then what do we have to do? No. So I'm aware of disconnected sectors. Things in many areas, there's delivery that's unclear, patients are unclear about what they can get, and it's unfair in terms of delivery. The relationship with population health needs has been historically very weak when you go out on a regional basis, and ultimately people get health where they live. The block grants, the weak contracts, the poor governance and accountability have basically undermined the funding and financial incentives to deliver what we need. And of course, we've an unplanned, weak dual systems. And as I say, the unplanned piece, I think, is the one thing that we really need to get on top of. So I think that the cross-party support is a potential game changer. I really do. Having seen what was around for such a period, having seen some good reports being written, what's out there, the fact that you get cross-party support at least gets it started. Now, you need to get the media as well, but you definitely have to get the political piece there. Why is it good? It's good because it's actually principles-based and it's this political buy-in. If it's principles-based, as things change, your principles tell you what to do. When you're not principles-based, if you're just being very pragmatic, then something changes, you've nowhere to go. It shows that real improvements take time and careful planning. Getting that message out there is so important. I mean, I can't tell you how many events, many of us in the room have probably been at, if somebody says, what's wrong with the health system? There must be there must be one thing, as if there's one thing. It's a very, very complex system. So the approach recommended is holistic with a focus on well-being and not just healthcare. And Jim's discussion about the Healthy Ireland thing, I think is really very important because we took ownership of the well-being piece along with the healthcare. Total healthcare system, not sectoral silos, which has been really has been bedeviling us for a very long period of time, and designed to manage patient pathways. And of course, chronic disease makes that absolutely essential if you're going to do it in a cost-effective way. The reorientation towards primary and community care sectors is absolutely right, but I've heard it for so long and so long and so long, and I'm wondering what does that mean? So people in the hospital care say, yeah, that's absolutely right. They need to do that. Now we'll hold on to all our budgets and all our resources, and they could do all of that, or we'll hold on to our budget share, and they will do all that. Get real, really, in some sense, that has to be done. So. One of the things about the report, I thought it was less clear about the relationship between the hospital sector and the other sectors. I think that can be dealt with, but I think let's not fudge it, because fudging it hasn't served us well in the past. And I think the report sees the need for a geographic base for the whole system. I mean, the HSE has been the last big bang, the last big plan that didn't work, and I think it's one of the things which we know some of the things that went wrong with it. But what we do know that we do need, and this I think has developed extremely well, and the Minister mentioned it as well this morning, we've set standards centrally for the whole country, and they get delivered locally. It's what bedeviled us in the past were standards that varied across hospitals or across regions of the old health boards, and in fact we're not consistent. So my personal perspective, but I'm an economist, so I'm not a health economist, so there are other competing calls on government expenditure. So you might all in the room think health is everything, but I can tell you there are other rooms in other places where energy is everything, where enterprise is everything, where social protection is everything, getting people into the labour force is everything. So it's really, really important to see that, and that's from my perspective. Most countries, as I said already, continue to battle with managing healthcare delivery and costs, so we're not alone. You'd think in the Irish media that we were the only countries with hospital waiting lists in the middle of the winter. God help us. But that's where we are. And the approach is principle-based with political buy-in. I give that 3 stars because to me that's the most important thing. And I think that real rationally based improvements take time and careful planning. And that means Jim can take out those slides for several years on and use them again and again because they're good slides, but he'll have to because people will forget it. I mean, there's a real issue that people take for granted something that they've got, or they forget all about the fact that it's been there. But we do need, and I think this is highly relevant to today, to the people in the room today, is the framework for dealing with capital planning and public-private issues. We need a framework for doing that. I think just in a way that allows people to make predictable decisions in relation to investments. Because if not, you'll undermine the system. And if you need any clue, how could that look like? Look at housing. Look what happened when effectively the housing market became undermined and you effectively don't get the investment when you want it. So the approach has to be incremented strategically. Slow, steady, boring is the way to do it. And I think we just get people in over a period of time to do it and do it on that basis. So what does that mean? We've got to recognise biases and groupthink among frontline providers and managers. Now, I'm repeating what I said earlier, but I really believe this very strongly. If you put a bunch of economists in the room, it's incredible how much they'll agree on. Add in a couple of sociologists and psychologists, it's getting a bit iffy. Taking a few scientists, taking a few medics, and you're into a different space. So we just have to realize that if we don't if we have groupthink among the people who are at the decision making and trying to bring this forward, it's simply not going to work. Unless the group is thinking in exactly the right strategic direction, then we can manage it. That means tackling pressure against reorientation of services across sectors, and is very interesting, this issue of taking activities out of hospitals. People in the room here are investing in hospitals. Hold on, they're taking people out of hospitals. Then really how one's remunerated becomes absolutely crucial. There's conflicts between accountability and reducing silos. I think this is something that people often fail to realise. Huge focus on accountability. Here's my budget, what did I spend it on? If I'm in a silo, I can be damn sure that that's my little budget, all on its own. I can be fully accountable for it. Now I've got to work with you, and you, and it gets all fuzzy. So we talk increasingly about accountability, but we don't realise that that actually generates a silo mentality unless you work at it very, very carefully. There are also, then we need to name the inefficient processes that were there. I have sort of family members who have been attending hospitals for things that should have been done in the local GP service, and people who are going to their GPs for their flu injection when they should be going to their pharmacist, etc., etc. We need to actually name those and be proactive in dealing with them. Contract designs need to be right. I mean, what's the date of the last GP contract? It was the 70s. Do you remember the 70s? Some of you don't. I do. I was very, very young. But quite seriously, that is just crazy. In a world where, what can you imagine, what business in Ireland, what other place in Ireland would have contracts in a world where there's been technological change, where there's been service change, delivery change, demands, etc., that would be sitting there. But we need to have those contracts linked to the principles. So if you're going to have a strategic set of principles, you need the contracts to talk directly. You need to say, that's why that's in the contract, because that's the principle that we're dealing with. If you don't, contracts end up being a bargain between some very tough vested interests, some of them possibly in the room, and some people who are at the other end of the taxpayers' money. And I think that that's a really important thing. And you need to review them. You need to decide it's got to be long enough to be meaningful. It's maybe 5 to 10 years, but not so long as the fact that we end up with them 40 years on. So the other thing I do believe in terms of getting contract design, it can be independent of ownership issues. You can write the contract whether it's a public or a private sector delivery. A thing that worries me a little bit in the report is there's talk about removing certain costs and charges. My feeling is don't increase demand until supply is in place, and take a bit longer. Okay, they want to do this in 10 years. Frankly, I don't mind if it's 11 or 11 and a half if they do it right. Rushing to do it in 10 so that you can tick box everything along the way, I think, is a mistake. So the focus on reducing payments incrementally rather than abolishing them, I think, is the right to go, because by reducing them incrementally, you also discover what latent demand is. But whereas if you abolish them immediately, boing, the next thing you're not able to necessarily deal with it. And then you want to monitor well-being aspects very carefully. So facilitators of change, and this is the last slide, really. A cross-governmental approach is terrific. And we have a new government, and in fact we have the same minister. How great is that? We have a Taoiseach who actually understands the Department of Health and the issues, and has been in the Department of Social Protection, which is the next most relevant department. And if you're trying to do something cross-government, it's probably the next most relevant one. But ultimately, it is a whole government approach, and there is a model of the Competitiveness Council, the National Competitiveness Council, which was set up in the 1990s to try and say, how do we fit the whole of the industrial sector together, so that we do the roads, we do the transport, we do the energy, we do all the different bits that make it work as a sector. And that's across departmental, external, independent people on it. There's a whole set of things on it, but that could be a potential model as part of what is there. But we also have to deal with, how are we going to manage subnational cross-sectoral budgets if we don't have something at a regional level to do that, to bring in the hospitals. Political acknowledgement of failures in the current system should be reflected in the emphasis on governance. And I think we are, as a country, shockingly bad on governance. Shockingly bad is all I'd say. And I think the public sector is possibly the weakest element of it, because it hasn't had to grapple with it in the same way that the private sector has had to do it. And I think that's a real challenge, and health is a place where it surely is. Should be reflected in contracts. We need regular voicing of the need for greater transparency and accountability of quality standards and appropriate regulation. And regulation is crucial, and it was great to hear the Minister describing some of the legislation that's coming through that I think will really support a better system, and improved use of data and information sharing. We need to have those things, because if we don't voice them regularly, what's going to happen is people will forget. And we only have to look across the water at Donald Trump and look across the water at the UK to realise that people can forget what exactly has been to their benefit at a different point in time. And finally, one of the nice things is that technology over the years has been moving in a direction to help us do a lot of this. And it's not the answer, it's not the panacea, it's not the answer to everything, but it is a facilitator of many of the tough things that challenges we need to do. So that's our system, and let's hope that we can make it work. Thank you.